Hello and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Courtney and I am a women's health exercise physiologist aiming to share all the ins and outs of women's health, being a practitioner and the mindset behind working for yourself. So if you are interested in all of those, then welcome to the podcast. And for all those that have been listening for a while, I know that this is supposed to be an interview with a special guest. However, I was asked to be a source of information for one of the beautiful ladies that has been following my Instagram account for a while around belt use and lifting. And I wanted to share this recording with you because it is a really great conversation around pressure management, prolapse, lifting, belt use in those who lift or either recreationally or through powerlifting. And there's a lot of valuable information in here that is really quite digestible because it is aimed towards the healthy population. So if you haven't really had exposure to this type of topic before, it might be a really nice way to start learning new things. And I personally found in my journey, the conversations between a healthcare provider and a healthy pop or personal trainer type person was a lot easier to understand and digest than straight into practitioner talk where we dive too much into the science and maybe not quite familiar with that. So I just want to share this with you. This is also such a valuable conversation because Kylie, who is interviewing me, was diagnosed with a double wall prolapse and was basically told that she could not lift anymore. And she was like super keen on powerlifting, bodybuilding background as well, comp prepping, all those types of really high end volume training. And she was really devastated. And she actually reached out to me for this conversation because a lot of people ask her about it. And there is just not that much easy, accessible information on the internet for women to navigate this space. And it still blows my mind every day, some of the conversations I have with people who aren't really in the pelvic floor space and they don't know things. If they can't find information, other healthcare providers don't have the knowledge for it. And I really think this highlights the importance of a well-rounded or in-depth knowledge in your topic, which I'm super, super passionate about niching down as, not even niching because that's such a buzzword right now, but more around really specializing in something to provide really top quality care for your clients. So if you're in this podcast right now and you see every client under the sun and you're not feeling very good about a particular skill set that you might have, or you don't feel like you know enough about something, or you feel a bit poor about not really knowing a lot about anything in particular, but knowing a little bit about everything, then I really encourage you to start thinking about maybe following a particular route and becoming like the go-to person in that scene, because that is what's changed in my career and made me super passionate about what I do, and also being able to guide my education and depth of knowledge. So I hope you enjoy this interview. It is a little bit more, not too super technical and sciencey based or physiology based, but there is a little bit of good quality nuggets in there. So I really hope you enjoy that. And if you want to go follow Kylie, she has a lot of training, online training for clients. So she has quite a good platform for the lifting side of things as well. Otherwise, yeah, enjoy.
Hi guys, welcome. Today I have a very special guest, Court from Her Exercise Physiology. Now, this is something I have wanted to talk about for quite a while, and we will dive into why. But this is outside my scope of practice, so I am bringing in Court to discuss today all things women's pelvic floor health, exercise, rehab. And yeah, so welcome, Court. Tell us a little bit about what it is you do and what you are here for.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really passionate about training and women's health. So I love just spreading the word of health out there. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this with all of your following. So I am an exercise physiologist. So everyone gets a bit confused about what that is, but we are professionals in exercise prescription to help with chronic and complex health conditions. So there are kind of different routes that you can go down with exercise physiology. Some EP is short for exercise physiologist. So if I say that, you know why. But some will go down they might go down like neurological pathways where they work on stroke rehab. Some will go down like cardiac conditions or all these different types of health conditions. I have particularly chosen women's health. So I do a lot of mostly pelvic floor related issues or pelvic health related concerns. So I work with women across all stages of the life cycle. We work on pelvic floor, whether it's incontinence, whether it's prolapse, whether it's more pelvic tightness, where they've got more pain-related symptoms. I work with a lot of endometriosis clients, or pregnancy, postnatal, transition to menopause, all those typical times where you would think, oh, there's pelvic floor concerns. I do a lot of other fertility health, and I do a lot of other women's health, but predominantly I'll work in that sort of pelvic floor, pelvic health space. And I use a lot of exercise prescription in order to help do that. So a little bit different from a physiotherapist, but sort of similar. So we get a little bit confused. So I run a fully online clinic and help women pretty much wherever they are, if they have internet access. So it's super exciting. Got a bit of a social media, so you can head over there if you want to follow that along. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, I try and share a lot of educational content too, just because I feel like there's not a lot of helpful stuff on the internet. It's really hard navigating it yourself sometimes. So trying to like peel back the layers of difficult searching, I guess.
I do love your content. I love your spin on it. Like, it's very educational, but it's not just the boring old, here, this is what you should do. Like, I love your take on it. So definitely go and check Court out. Obviously, I will tag her below.
Yeah.
I do love what you're doing.
I'm not a very like nurturing, soft, like I just like get to the point.
Hey, you gotta do it.
And I can joke about it because it's kind of funny sometimes. So yeah, if you don't really like that kind of humor, you probably won't like my stuff.
You'll either love it or you won't, but I think you will.
Yeah, but anyway.
Wonderful. So I guess maybe a little bit around my background and why I want to raise awareness more so on the topic and just open up more conversations in regards to pelvic floor is because personally myself, if you do not know, I have a prolapse myself. So I was diagnosed 2 years ago in May. So it's been 2 years since I was diagnosed, and that seems crazy. 2 years with a stage 2 posterior prolapse and stage 1 anterior prolapse. So at first I was just in shock because obviously I love to weights train, and the first person I saw was just a gynecologist and pretty much told me to stop weights training. And I remember having a conversation with you years ago, Court.
Yeah.
I was devastated. I thought that's it. I had to give up lifting weights. And that's obviously not the case. The right help, like Courtney, you can really manage it and work through it. So for me, like I didn't even really know this was a thing. And especially like I'd had 2 kids. I got my checkup from the GP 6 weeks after giving birth, and they're like, yep, you're fine. You can go back to training. And even though I'd been in the field for years, no one talks about this or doesn't say, right, maybe you don't go straight back to doing squats or deadlifts, or, don't chuck your belt on for squats. This is everything that I did. So I've obviously made my prolapse worse because no doubt I would have had it once I'd given birth. But I made it worse by lifting heavy still, wearing about, not doing all the correct breathing and bracing, and maybe we'll cover that a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And just wearing a belt all the time. And so I guess that's what I kind of want to talk about, just to bring some light to the topic for someone. And you don't even have to be postpartum, right? Like, especially women, right? They can have symptoms of a weak pelvic floor and could potentially be making it worse by wearing a belt. Yeah. So I guess
there's so much we can dive into.
Oh, I know, right? So we'll touch a bit of it obviously today, and I'll let Court talk about that. So I guess maybe first question we could get into around, especially my scenario, which a lot of people could probably relate to, is wearing a belt. Like, when should we potentially be wearing a belt or not wear a belt?
So I think it is really hard to say like a blanket rule for every person, because I know that it is really important for certain types of lifting. So like the powerlifting scene is
100%.
Needs a belt at some point. It's part of, especially if like they've got equipped lifting as well. So if you're in that scene where there's equipped lifting and you're actually using all this stuff, but you're at these really high levels of exertion where you're going to need a lot more like support through your trunk. So the idea or the concept behind the belt is that it's going to help produce more stability for you to actually lift off. And we need a lot of stability through the trunk to execute movements when we're thinking about like heavier lifting. And the more heavy that we're lifting, then the more stability that we kind of need. And we talk about, you'll see a lot in the pelvic floor space about intra-abdominal pressure and developing intra-abdominal pressure or managing pressure. And we refer to this as like the pressure that gets built up inside the abdomen in response to changes in breathing, but also in response to different exercises that we do. And sometimes we can, without the belt, this is without the belt used, but we can sometimes create more pressure by pushing outwards on all like structures to create rigidity and make pressure and make it easier for ourselves to like brace. And the concept of the belt is to do the same thing. So we place the belt around there, you push into the belt and you create tension around your trunk to create pressure that eventually, becomes stability through the trunk, and that you can drive up through the movement, because if you have a stable base, then you would be able to use your bigger global muscles a lot better to actually push and drive movement. So when we're talking about wearing a belt, you're going to need a lot of support at some levels of resistance, especially those max lifts. Like if you're probably like, I kind of think if you're doing 1, 2, maybe even 3 reps, maybe even up to 5, depending on like where you are in your training cycle, then a belt might be an appropriate level of use at that point. However, if you're on the edge of like 5 or more reps, I would probably say you don't need it, because the load shouldn't be heavy enough for you to be requiring that belt. So you should be able to maintain that brace. Now, in saying that, you need to be able to correctly use the belt. Learning how to use a belt is so important, because you have to be able to brace well, understand when to use it and how to use it, because you also then need to be able to also use your core correctly whilst using the belt. Yes. And when you're not using the belt, you also need to then understand how to use your core properly outside of the belt use. So sometimes we can use, like you'll need different core bracing strategies depending on if you're using a belt or if you're not using a belt. So the powerlifting scene, if you have a really great coach, is very good at teaching these proper techniques, because there's like your breath control or your Valsalva maneuver, where you're actually using your breath to create more pressure as well. You're using the belt well, it's phased into your programming well, maybe you're using it towards those higher rep ranges. But then you've got the powerlifting, sorry, not the powerlifting scene, like the bodybuilding scene or the, let's say, recreational training, where there's like almost like an image. I'm just seeing like this image of a belt being like part of the image, that you wear the belt when you train and you use it, and it's almost being used as like a waist trainer and they're just wearing it.
I see it all the time. Like I think I did a little reel the other day, like people just doing lateral raises. Or like a lat pull down for 12 reps.
Yeah.
I'm like, what are you wearing a belt?
Like, are you? Yeah. So I mean, like in a sense of exercise, like, okay, let's also keep in mind that the belt you should be used on like those big functional lifts, not like if you're doing a 3RM lat pull down. I don't really know like if that gets programmed, but I mean, you probably don't really need a belt then either. Yeah. But they're using it for like bicep curls, lateral raises, like face pull exercises, tricep extensions. I used to see it. I worked at Anytime Fitness, where there was a lot of like not uneducated training happening, where it was just like follow whatever someone else was doing, and there was so much belt use for no reason at all. Now, I'd love to like talk about why that's a problem. If you're,
I would love to, definitely, please.
Just like cut me off if you need.
No, I love it. I love it.
So like, I want you to think about, in a sense of pelvic health, pelvic floor health, even core strength. We're talking about things like hernias as well. Like all these pressure-based problems can come about from poor management of pressure. Now, if you have a belt on and you don't need it, there's a couple of different things that can happen. Like, first of all, it's quite tight around your abdomen, which means that you are going to be increasing pressure within there for like probably no real reason or excessive amounts. That's going to be pushed onto other structures. And if you have a tissue in that system that is a lot weaker, then the pressure is going to move towards that weaker tissue and then push more load onto it. So when we think about tissue adaptation, it can be bad and good. So we always think about like stressing tissues to get stronger and build and hypertrophy and all this stuff. But we can also create excessive loads that create dysfunction, weakness, injury, right? Things like that. A prolapse, for example, is one. So if you have a lot of weakness in those tissues, maybe you don't really know it's there yet, and then you're wearing this belt all the time, you're pushing all this extra pressure onto these weaker structures and then creating excessive weakness over time. So that's what could be happening when you're like, you know how you said, oh, I could have been making things worse. It might have been that there was too much pressure in the system for those tissues to like be held on up against, if that makes sense, dealing with that amount of pressure. So like if you don't need to use a belt because you're not lifting heavy, then you probably shouldn't be wearing one because
then obviously, right, not using the belt, they should be learning correctly how to then obviously build pressure themselves and use those intra-abdominal, those muscles, right? Make them stronger without the belt.
Yeah, like we have a system that we create stability with, like pelvic floor, the deeper abdominal wall muscles, your diaphragm. We have all these other postural muscles that are supposed to be switching on at certain times to help create stability. And they can be a little bit weak and people experience poor stability, but you can definitely strengthen them, like apply the certain amount of load, work the exercise as well, and you can get really good at using those muscles. And even at those heavier loads, there's a lot of people that still lift quite heavy without using any belt, even like 1, 2, 3 or 4 reps where you're just like, you know what, is the risk versus the reward? Probably not. So you can definitely still create a lot of that strength, stability, and core support without using that. And you should be doing it, because if you are not using them well, you're also then untraining them. So they're going to become weaker over time. So there's like a lot involved with the whole belt use thing and no education around it, in a sense of like, you just purchase a belt and you go, oh, wear that with exercises, and that's it.
Wonderful. Yeah, that was definitely me. And since having the prolapse, the first thing I was told was to remove my belt so that I would then really focus on strengthening my core muscles, and pretty much had to retrain the way I squatted and deadlifted, like the big compound movements. And I actually feel so much stronger now, now getting those activated correctly, than I did before just chucking on my belt. Like I feel so much stronger. And I'm symptom free now with my prolapse and can lift, I know, which is so good.
That everyone should take note of that, because if you have a prolapse and you're worried about it, here's some evidence that you can actually do a lot for it.
100%. So no more pain. No. And that's another thing, right? Like incontinence. Like a lot of women, I guess, going a little bit off topic here. Incontinence, like a lot of women, and I think I've seen one of your posts you just put up, it was funny. They just wear a pad because they think a little bit of leaking is normal, but it's actually not, right? Like the amount of women I hear, I just, I'll chuck a pad on, or, you'll hear, I've even heard a friend tell me that her coach said to her, just wear a pad. Like a coach said that to her. I'm not even joking. I'm just like, it's not actually normal to have incontinence when we're training, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, there are times where the loads, it's like any muscle. There is a point in time where it's at its maximal ability. So if you're lifting so heavy, and you're doing a 1RM, maybe you're at your comp and you're going for a 1 rep max, and you're probably, maybe then it's like a bit more like common. And it's not so detrimental, but still it's a sign that something's not strong enough. Like I just look at it like you shouldn't be peeing yourself. Like no one, like it's not, like your body isn't supposed to do that. So if you are, it's telling you something. It's telling you that there's a weakness in the system and it's not able to cope with that particular activity, whatever that might be. Standing around, walking, running, skipping, lifting heavy, jumping, box jumps, burpees, whatever it might be. Like there's something in the system not coordinating well, not turning up well. Maybe the pelvic floor isn't strong enough. Maybe you're pushing more pressure onto your pelvic floor by accident, not realizing that. You're creating like leaking, but it is definitely something that you should be addressing. I mean, well, you don't have to. You can live with it if you want. It's up to you, but it's probably going to get worse. Could lead to a prolapse, but you definitely don't need to be masking it with a pad. I mean, it's a good temporary use for like training and feeling safe, but it is by no means the fix of your problem. It's just the little Band-Aid. It's like, oop, slap this on and it won't be a problem anymore, but it's it's still a problem.
And that was even me. That's like even me being naive. Like if I had the same thing, like I thought, oh yeah, like I would squat for 10 reps, or even when I did maybe 7 to 8 reps,
Mm-hmm.
I would just wear like a light little liner because I was like, oh, it's normal, but realizing it's not. And now, again, after working with a specialist, I haven't had that issue in over a year.
Yeah.
So you can
Great.
make it better. Like you don't have to have that. Like it's, yeah, like maybe like if I go back to powerlifting, I might have that. But yeah, like just knowing that you can actually fix that. Like, I train a lot of mums, even some elder women, if they do something where I'm like, okay, you're going to have to do some jumping, or they're like, oh, like they'll freak out, and that's not a comfortable feeling, right? So knowing that there is help out there,
Mm-hmm.
for something like that, which is
Yeah,
great.
well,
Yeah.
it's just about the tissues needing to adapt to a certain level of load. It's just like any other muscle. So there's a weakness there, except instead of maybe pain, like when you have a shoulder injury or the shoulder muscles aren't working and you go to a physio and they're like, oh, this isn't activating well enough. It's the same thing, except you just get P instead of pain, like heaviness or pressure. Or maybe you do get pain if you have pelvic floor tightness, which is also a thing that could lead to pain as well. So there is definitely so much you can do about it. And it's not always just like pelvic floor strength either. There is a lot of things contributing to that, like leaking and pelvic floor problems. So if you're only doing pelvic floor exercises, then you might also need more.
Yes. Perfect. Wonderful. Right, let's have a little look at maybe some of the questions that we got.
Yeah, sure.
Let's have a look. Are there any exercises I should avoid postpartum? So maybe like the early postpartum days. So let's say like the first 3 months at least?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's about building your capacity to do exercises, how they should be performed once the tissues have recovered. So initially, when you're fresh out of birth, everything's like, I mean, you've had a baby, right? So you know how much your posture changes, how much some tissues, just like all muscles, let's talk all the muscles, get really lengthened and don't do a very good job, and others get really, really tight. And that's because we shift around. Now, they need to be retrained to bring balance back to the system. So if you're doing a lot of exercises that are not helpful for restoring the body back to its like normal function, then it's going to be not the best idea. But it's also going to be about whether or not they can cope with those amounts of load. For example, your abdominal wall. Let's talk about that, because that's pretty much what everyone thinks is the thing you should be worried about: core work, pelvic floor work, things like that. So you get like a lot of stretching through the front of your abdomen, which then reduces its ability to contract and create a lot of strength or pressure or force production, which is required for a certain amount of activities. So if you are going and doing all of these exercises that are too hard for that muscle to perform, you're going to maybe cause more problems. You're not going to strengthen it very well. It's going to have a hard time healing. It's like what we talked about earlier with those tissue adaptations. Like if you're providing too much of the wrong load, it goes the opposite way. It's not helpful. It's almost detrimental. So we've got a lot of laxity or a lot of let's say looseness through that tissue right between your six pack. So you can end up with abdominal separation. And if you overload that too much, it can stop it from coming back together or healing. So if you're doing a lot of crunches, if you're doing a lot of planks, high loaded core work where you feel like it's really hard, and that could be a little bit different for everyone depending on what your ability is like, then you could be actually disservicing yourself rather than helping it heal. So you have to go through a slow exposure of load. You have to retrain how the muscles turn up in the proper like coordination, because they change in pregnancy. Then you have to slowly add load and get a little bit difficult. So I think a lot of women go through pregnancy and they start off really active, and then they all get to the end and they're just slowing down and reducing the amount of load. It's kind of like going the opposite way now. We go back to like start small and then add more as we get further down the pathway of postpartum. So within the first 6 weeks, let's talk about that, because most women will go to their 6-week checkup and they're going to get told by their GP that it's safe to exercise. Within that first 6 weeks, there is still things you can do to restore tissue function. So we're talking about like activation exercises and connecting with muscles that may have become a little bit asleep during pregnancy. We call that like inhibited. The muscle doesn't fire as well. It doesn't work as well. So we can reconnect, retrain the coordination. So you would have done like I mean, this is part of your prolapse recovery. It would have been like coordinating pelvic floor with diaphragm, making sure you're breathing really well, switching it on your back, laying down, super simple exercise, but probably quite hard to coordinate at the time.
Yeah, it felt so hard. I was like, what?
Like, man, I lift weights. How come this is so hard?
Honestly, yeah. And there was still also progression in that too, which I found very interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess you would probably do something similar also postpartum, right? Even if you didn't have the prolapse to
same thing.
That. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So like the first thing, I kind of started laying on my back, and then I sat up because that's putting some more pressure, then doing it sitting up, and then doing it standing up.
Yeah.
And then we got to adding load.
Yeah, because it's easier to also do things with gravity's not involved. So if you're laying down on your back or you're in like an all fours, there's a bit more gravity in all fours, but those positions are a lot easier. So as you come into upright postures, gravity becomes involved. So do all the postural muscle demand, because they have to keep everything, like otherwise you'd flop over, right? You have no postural support. Yeah, and then you add external load as well. So same kind of thing. So you need to go through these or I guess retraining exercises, and also things like mobility and making sure that tissues that have become shortened or tight can become a little bit longer, and the ones that become longer, we're activating those to make them a bit shorter and stronger. So we can do a lot of things like that, even just like gentle walking to keep you moving. Something small, doesn't have to be a lot, but that's like the first 6 weeks before you even go to the GP. You can definitely do something like that. I would probably get some more guided advice on it, because everyone needs something a bit different depending on how they adapted or changed during pregnancy, what their birth was like, what their labor was like, things like that. But there's a lot of things you can do. Now, once you get cleared for your 6-week check, the doctor's going to say you can go back and train, but that doctor does not know what you were doing, number one, doesn't know your capacity of what you did before. So like you were lifting heavy, right? He doesn't know like, oh, she's doing a body weight squat, sitting down onto a box and standing up like a sit to stand. Like, so he's like, oh yeah, you could squat. And like, you're like, what, with my 100 kilos on my back? Or like, are you sure? Like has no idea. Doesn't also understand tissue adaptation and muscle training, things like that. They're GPs. They're not exercise professionals. So it's okay for you to start doing more functional activity, probably in a very slow exposure to load way, like what you talked about before, upright postures, body weight, add load slowly, coordinate everything well in those movements. Really important. So like there are certain things in that time frame up until, say, from the 6 weeks even to the 3 months that you should be avoiding, because your body isn't ready for that. But that can look like something different for everyone. So people manage pressure differently. People activate tissues in different positions. People need more strength in some exercise, some muscles more than others, especially with, say, a diastasis or abdominal separation. Some have more separation at the top, some have more at the bottom. That can tell us a lot about which muscles of the abdominal wall need more strength and which ones are a little bit too tight or a bit dominant. So we can train certain things. So there is no real like blanket rule, like don't do this. But if it feels hard, if you feel like heaviness, pressure, pain, or it doesn't feel like you're strong enough to do, don't do it.
Perfect. Yeah.
Like that's my advice.
That they're the ones.
Little nutshell.
Perfect.
So
definitely, I think
just reach out and get some help.
And I think that's the biggest thing. You know, we all just have thought for so long, you just go to your GP, general practitioner, they just take your blood pressure. They don't even do an external examination, nothing. They just check your blood pressure and say, yep, you're healthy, you're fine, go and train. So I think what I learned, the biggest thing, and what I tell all my clients, all my friends, is at that 6 weeks postpartum, go and see a specialist. Because especially if you want to get back into weights training, I think it's so important.
It's funny how I actually reached out to a doctor to ask about what were they checking at a 6-week check, because I'd like to know more about this. And they talked a lot more about, like, this was quite a like well-rounded GP that was a little bit like passionate about like referring women to specialists, so had a bit more awareness. Some of them aren't like that, unfortunately, but she definitely talked a lot more about like we're checking for mental health issues really, and whether the baby's okay, whether the mother's okay, whether the support network is okay, are they coping well enough, do they need more like support from that perspective, and we're looking for general health markers to be back on track. There's no real like, we might be looking at like, are they ready to exercise from a mental perspective, or whether their tissues are healing if it was traumatic, or whether they've had stitches or things like that. But like, I'm not looking to clear someone to go back to what you were doing. I would recommend them get help for that.
That's
So
so
like
good.
when I
Yeah.
think about that, I'm like, oh, that's actually quite a valid point. Like they're not really too worried about your exercise ability. They're there to make sure you're mentally coping, because being a
Yeah.
mom's hard.
Yes.
Newborn life. Like,
100%.
are you actually okay?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, like imagine if you were not mentally okay, you weren't sleeping, you weren't eating, you weren't hydrating. There is no way you should be exercising then anyway,
Yeah.
because you
You
don't
put
have,
stress on the body.
yeah, too much stress. You don't have the nutrition or the ability to heal tissues. If they are, you're probably more at risk of causing more problems. So like it makes sense.
Yep, definitely. So seek help, guys. That's the answer.
Yes.
Seek professional help. All right, let's have a look. What else have we got? I guess there was a question about exercises to make your pelvic floor stronger. I guess we kind of touched base on that.
I think I'd like to just touch a little bit on that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Because I think we did talk about the progressive overload that you setting up, right? But that is not, let's clear that up. It's not just like, it doesn't mean just do pelvic floor squeezes or Kegel exercises, laying down, then in seated, then in upright. Like do not take this and go and do this yourself thinking it's going to work. Because how your pelvic floor is what we call like an anticipatory muscle, and it is supposed to automatically just turn on and fire in a certain pattern before your other muscles turn on. So like when you go to lift something, your deep core should be like getting ready to turn on before you even do anything, because that's the way it's supposed to be. And we need to make sure it's trained like that. So it has to turn up in a certain way before everything else. So like this is what we talk about when we're looking at strengthening the pelvic floor. It's not just about squeezing and making sure the muscle itself squeezes. It's got to turn on at the right time in all the different exercises as well, and then coordinate with other muscles. So like if you're not very strong through say glutes or hip muscles, it's going to put a lot more load on your pelvic floor to do more stability work as well, and more say drive, well, it doesn't drive the movement, but it's part of that system. Then it will not be strengthening it really well, even if you are kind of turning it on really. Like, so there is a big interplay of like postural muscles and global muscles feeding into pelvic floor strength as well. So there's a lot outside of just that. So if you are doing all these Kegels and pelvic floor exercises and you're not getting the full result, like it's getting better, but it's not really progressing much further, then you need other exercises to help support that as well.
Yep, perfect. Wonderful. And like, because obviously you are all online, so anyone can come to you, whether they've postpartum or whether they're feeling any symptoms, or I guess even all of us, right? It's progression. We can always become stronger. So even if anyone wanted to reach out and say, look, I feel like my core is maybe not as strong, or they don't have that much stability, then you'd be able to look at, prescribing something there for them, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think like there's a lot just about education and prevention, especially if you haven't had kids yet and you're planning on children. Like the number one thing I talk about in most of my pre-conception or pregnancy consults is like, if you understand how all this works, how it feels, what to do in exercises, you can have such a better recovery postnatal, even though everything does go through labor or pregnancy, then labor and birth, and it's going to probably get weak. Maybe it'll get tight. Maybe you'll end up with a prolapse because of the birth that you had. It was high amounts of pressure and there was not much you could do about it. You still understand the concept and where to start, and you know the process. It's like such a much better, like imagine if you knew that, like when you'd finish, you would have just been like, oh, you know what? I've got prolapse. I'll be fine. I'm just going to do this, reach out for help. Like it's like so much more feeling of safeness, I think, than fear. And to be honest with you, I bet you there's a lot of you watching this that haven't had children, that have pelvic floor issues, think it's normal, and probably should do something about it now before you actually go through a pregnancy.
100%, definitely, because most likely, right, if they have got some small issues prior to pregnancy, it's going to get a lot worse.
Yeah. And if you're in the training space, I see a lot more issues with over clenching, over recruitment of certain muscle groups, especially core work, because of like, if you have sort of just started your journey, or you've previously done like lots of ab workout, like I feel like women tend to just go down that like ab training all the time, like crunches, twists, med ball, like all those conventional core exercises, and just end up with all this tightness, and can end up with more tension-based pelvic floor problems, which can actually cause more problem than the weakness at some points in time as well. So because your audience is actually like quite a training, fitness, loading, lifting weights. Like, you should understand the whole concept of this, because it's important for your progress and your ability to lift more, which you've said yourself, once you've trained it, you feel stronger, but also from like a preventative point of view for like further issues as well. So just be mindful of that as well.
Okay, so our last question we have here is cesarean births. Can that, or does that still have an effect on the pelvic floor?
Yes, great question. I feel like a lot of women think that this will save them. Like, oh, I don't need to worry, I've had a cesarean. Or I'm planning a cesarean because I don't want to do anything to my pelvic floor and I'm scared of a prolapse. But I want to talk a little bit about this, because when you have, like, pregnancy itself will create changes in your pelvic floor. Research has already shown us this. Doesn't even matter what birth or delivery you actually have, you can still have a lot of changes within the tissues of the pelvic floor. Lots of weakness and laxity. We get lots of different physiological changes for that reason. Like your pelvis is shifting, right? So things are going to change. So it doesn't matter. Number one, pregnancy changes your pelvic floor. But the second issue is that I want you to imagine like your ability to manage this pressure inside your trunk comes from a combination or a group of muscles that need to work together. So you've got your abdominal wall, your pelvic floor, your diaphragm, you've got a couple of back muscles as well. But for the sake of this being easy to understand, those couple of muscles. Now, if you've cut through one of them because you've gone through a cesarean delivery, or even like an abdominal surgery, it doesn't have to be cesarean delivery, but it could be any sort of abdominal surgery, and you've had a big incision there, everything's stitched back up. Not only do you have like the muscles have been cut through, so their ability to contract well or receive signals from the brain to contract can change. So then you don't have that abdominal wall support as much as what you did. So how the pressure gets managed is different, and it can often push a lot of pressure down onto the pelvic floor, and in response create this higher tone or increased tension in the pelvic floor. So I see a lot of cesarean deliveries end up with pelvic floor tightness. So they're going to be experiencing urgency. They're going to be experiencing feelings like they've got UTIs, and maybe they don't have any UTIs, or they're really struggling with like fully emptying their bladder. Maybe they've got pelvic pain or pain with penetration, pubic bone pain, tailbone pain, maybe they're constipated, things like that. So when we think about that, like, that's a pelvic floor issue. If there's no ability for that pelvic floor to lengthen and absorb all forces or help with the pressure management, like in a sense of absorbing load, then we get too much stiffness that can also lead to leaking. So just because you're leaking doesn't necessarily mean your pelvic floor is also weak, could be tight. So cesareans will play a lot of role in that, and also all the connective tissue. So when you think about like, you would know about fascia, but you have this like structure of tissue that goes around everything a bit like a stocking, and it feeds around through the whole body, and it's connected to everything else. And when tension gets pulled in all places, it can lead to tension in other places. So if you imagine like all this tension in the front of your abdomen from where your cesarean is, it feeds right down into the front of that pelvic floor and pulls on tension through there too. So I think the biggest symptom I see around this is like pain with penetration that might refer into their cesarean scar as well, where they can feel like, oh, I get pain shooting through here, and it's comes from all this tension and tightness through all of the muscle tissue and connective tissues as well. So cesarean deliveries do not save your pelvic floor from any problems.
Sounds worse.
Well, to be honest, and
cutting through the muscles.
I actually think like
I didn't even really think of it like that, honestly, because I'm like, I know you're cutting through the abdominal muscle, so that's going to take a lot of healing and reactivation. But then, like the way you've just said that, it sounds a lot worse.
Like, have you ever had like a muscle tear?
No, I haven't, luckily enough. You've
seen like people that have bicep tears where they tear off the muscle. I mean, that's pretty dramatic, but like that takes ages to like actually recover and repair. And we're just like, oh, just cut this, and like 6 weeks later you can go back and lift. And it's like,
very true. Great. Like, I love that.
Yeah, you haven't actually done anything to fix that. Like, if you had a surgery in any other musc issue, you would have to follow a very strict rehab protocol, like a ACL injury for your knee. Like, there's like a 12-week return to like running or return to impact training. We have to activate the muscle, make sure there's range of motion, integrate it into functional activities, and then load. It's like the same process, but we just don't do that for birth in general, but also cesarean deliveries. So if you've had a cesarean delivery or you're planning on one and you think it's going to save your pelvic floor, and that's the only reason why you're doing it. Like, a lot of women have to go down that route, and it's emergency and it's for the safety and it's fine.
But just keep that in mind. It's not protective of core problems. Definitely by no means.
Thank you, Court. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and all this beautiful education that we can spread the word.
Yes.
And if you guys have any more questions, please drop it down below and remember to go and follow the gorgeous Court.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. See you soon.